Hey folks, my name's Kevin and it's time for a little bit more knife nerdery, and today we're going to be taking a look at this absolutely gorgeous new knife that's coming out this year from Artisan Cutlery. Quick update from the future, I filmed this video almost an entire year ago and Artisan just took a really long time to release it, but they officially did, or at least a silver version. I don't know if they're even going to do a black version, but I think they are. The actual production versions also has pinstriping, which is something I didn't know about when I filmed this. It looks really cool. Anyway, let's get on with the rest of the video. This is designed by Rodgers, aka Nitch Designs. That's a friend of mine, and he was kind enough to send this prototype along to me, so huge thank you to Nick for letting me check this out. As we talk through what's going on in this knife, some of the really cool things that it's doing, and some also things that should be done differently, we're going to talk also through what, of course, is going to change, because this is, remember, a prototype. Nick Rodgers is a, I guess, knife designer in California, but these days, if you're following his Instagram, he's also been trying his hand at making some knives, primarily kitchen knives and some small fixed blades, and it's really cool getting to see that process take fold. And one of the things that's common across all of Nick's designs, because Nick has several designs through Artisan and through other people. He just had a really cool, complicated knife come out from Tucson. One thing that's common across all of them and the things he's making himself now is that he has a very strong visual style. These knives are heavily stylized. They have dramatic swoops and curves to them, and he's not making boring, plain, this just looks like every other knife I've seen knife. And a good example of that is the Ahab that he did through Artisan Cutlery. This is another knife that has really dramatic swoops and curves to it. Significant, obvious harpoon here, really tall blade, big curves here. Everything here is stylized, but the really important thing is that Nick doesn't make knives that are stylized at the expense of practicality. This is an exceptionally good user of a knife because of how comfortable this handle feels, because of how good your thumb locks in here and your finger locks in these different positions, because of how tall this is, it makes a really good slicer. These are things that he's thought through from a functionality perspective, but the end result is they just look really neat too. Now, they might not be everyone's cup of tea because of how stylized they are, and there's some people, even like me personally, who tends to go for more kind of simplistic, refined, simple looking knives, but what we have here is something that's not as kind of wild and dramatic, but instead is just so elegant. My God, this thing is absolutely gorgeous. And the lines on here, this is amazing. That's one of the main things I want to talk about, is just the really clever use of lines, the way these swoops are changing in a way that's aesthetically beautiful, but also functional. There's a lot to unpack here, and I'm really excited to talk about it. So let's talk briefly about the name of this knife, because it's also going to be a good segue into one of the most visually prominent differences between this and the production version, the shape of this shield. This knife is called the Weyden, W-E-Y-D-E-N. And just like this, the Ahab is a literary reference, Captain Ahab, Moby Dick, harpoon, it all ties together. This is a reference to Jack London's Seawolf, the protagonist named Humphrey Van Weyden. Now, that wasn't originally what this was going to be named. I think this was originally going to be named the Knell, K-N-E-L-L, like a death knell, ringing of a bell. If it was a literary reference, again, it's probably something like For Whom the Bell Tolls from Hemingway or something like that, but it's ultimately ended up having to be changed because of a cultural difference between the United States and China. In America, we practically worship death. We have references to death absolutely everywhere. But in China, there's a pretty significant cultural stigma and taboo around things explicitly referencing death. And so Artisan said they weren't completely comfortable with having a knife whose name and shape here were such explicit death references. But this gave Nick an opportunity, actually, to make something that I think is going to be even better. The new shape is both a little bit larger, a little bit more prominent, but also just a significantly better tie into the overall knife. It's a houndstooth shape like this. And as cool as I think this looks, the stark, sharp corners of it and straight lines, I just don't think fit the overall aesthetic very well, whereas the houndstooth flows much better into the shape of the overall handle. It also gives him the opportunity to have this swoop right here, which references a swoop right here, which we're going to talk about that when we talk about changes coming to the flipper tab. Anyway, the houndstooth also ties in with this new name, because Jack London's Seawolf, Captain Wolf Larsen, wolf, houndstooth, canine thing. And the end result, I think, is something that just is a much more cohesive package. And I'm pretty pleased that that's how it turned out. Let's keep talking about the overall aesthetic of this knife, because I think this is one of the things that Nick did so incredibly well here. Compared to something like the Ahab, this is more, I'd say, constrained. I don't mean that word in a negative or positive way. It's just the literal, it's more pulled in. And so it doesn't have quite as dramatic of swoops, but still gives you the ability to have this really stylized knife and this significant, my knife doesn't look like your knife kind of thing going on. One of the things that he does here really, really well is symmetry of curves and balance. So if you look at this, the blade shape here, the swoops here, the use of these swedges here, it all echoes the handle shape incredibly well. There's a very nice symmetry and balance here. And this Swedge is also referencing these significant and really interesting chamfers on this side. Now, Nick said that in designing this, he was trying to channel Michael Raymond. And Michael Raymond, he's one of those custom knife makers that his knives look so pristine and perfect that they practically look like CGI renderings. It's wild. But one of the things that Michael Raymond does really, really well is this use of curves where he makes these elegant flowing knives. And you can definitely see that coming through here, especially in this kind of swoop up to the front, this use of chamfers here, and the significant use of chamfering along the outsides to give this kind of impression of contouring. These are flat, but this is a significant amount of net contouring. I personally, when I first saw this, also thought it looked kind of like the Peter Rossetti Toad, because all Raymond's knives, especially like the Starlet and something like the Zyra, I don't know how you pronounce that knife, they all flow to this point in the back here. And I think that this is such a well-balanced knife, but I want to really emphasize something here. The curves here aren't just aesthetically interesting, they're functional. So what we have here is a really large chamfer at the back where it's a very shallow slope that then changes the angle as it goes to become a much, much steeper slope at the top. This is important for a couple of reasons. One, the significant shallow slope at the back makes this feel contoured in your hand. It gives you a significant amount of curvature at the back that allows it to wrap and fit into your hand in the way that you want to hold in these different grips. Your hand is able to curl around it. But by having that angle change as we get to the front, it actually flattens this back out to the point where at the top here, you're basically pressing on something that is almost flat. Why that matters is because it gives you a significantly wider space up here to press on with your hands. It makes it more comfortable for your thumbs, but it also gives you a wider leverage here, so it makes it less likely to twist in your hand. So overall, having it change the angle like this means that it not just looks cool, but fits into your hand and it works more functionally as well. Another neat aesthetic thing that he's doing in this handle here is he has a raised backspacer. Now, a lot of times people go out of their way to try and make a backspacer as flush as possible, but this is intentionally raised for just an aesthetic purpose. If you look, it is flush at the back right there, and it's flush right here at the front, but in the middle, it has this raise up where you get to see yet another chamfer. One of the reasons why this is neat is because not only does it look cool, but it does continue that kind of flow as you go around, which makes this feel in hand even more rounded and contoured, despite all of these being technically flat slabs. That chamfering is, of course, obviously carried through to the blade, and man, aesthetically, I just think it looks so cool. This flow here, if you look at this line, this continues seamlessly into here. And so this whole thing feels like a cohesive package. This top part swells up higher than it does over here. And as a result, this swedge is taller. Now, the one thing about that taller swedge, from a functional perspective, this is pretty thin blade stock. This is just over 0.1. And so the result of this being taller, unfortunately, means that this has plenty of time to thin back out. And so at the very top here, while it's not thin like the edge of the knife down here, it is thin enough that I don't find this to be tremendously comfortable to press my finger on. You can see that as it comes down, it thickens back out towards the tip. And so if you are doing the thing where you pinch up all the way and put your finger right here, this is actually pretty comfortable. And if you're doing this in this kind of pinch grip to do utility cuts, this actually works quite nicely. But I find that if I'm choked back a little bit, on the one hand, this fits my hand curve so nicely, but on the other hand, I'm having to put my finger on a relatively flat spot. Now, this is something that's not going to change for the production version, but in the future, I would encourage Nick and others to make the angle of your swedge slightly less aggressive. By simply making this angle, pulling it up slightly, you're going to get the same visual look because you're going to have a different plane right here, but it won't come to quite as thin of a spot. It'll be just a little bit wider, and I think would be a little bit more comfortable. That's less of a deal the thicker your blade stock, but on thin slicing knives like this, where again, this is only 0.1, you have to pay more and more attention to how thin you actually make it in the other spots, especially if you're going to be putting your finger there. Focusing in on this blade as a cutting tool, this is a knife after all, what we have here is geometry that is really, really good for both slicing and utility cuts. This is thin blade stock, like I said. This is only 0.1 inches. And so even though this isn't the tallest grind ever, it's 0.7 inches, significantly shorter than you find over here, this is still thin enough blade stock that this makes this a very thin slicing knife. Now, this doesn't come to absurdly thin behind the edge. I measured it about 19 to 20 thousandths behind the edge, but part of the reason for that is that the angle on this is actually really aggressive, the angle of the actual edge itself. I measured this at only 15 to 16 degrees, and that's the kind of angle you put on something for a very aggressive slicing. But one of the side effects of that is that the more aggressive you make the actual edge, the further that edge is going to come up onto the blade. And so that means that behind that edge is going to be further up the blade, and hence this being 19 thousandths. Anyway, coming back up, the shape of this means that we have basically belly the entire way. This is shallow enough of a belly. This is kind of near flat at the back, but it means that this is, I think he even is going as far as calling this a modified Wharncliffe. I wouldn't necessarily call it that, but this is the kind of thing where the tip is very low down. So like I said earlier, this is so easy to use this tip, especially if you're choking up like this. You can get really, really good control with this tip to make very careful and intricate utility cuts. This tip is nice and precise right up here, so it allows you to get in and kind of do that piercing ability, or kind of get into small spaces and make a very intricate cut. Coming to the back of it, man, they did the sharpening choil on this so well. So the sharpening choil is this notch right back here, and the plunge grind is the swoop right here that takes these from the full thickness down to this thinness behind the edge. And if you look at how this is done, the swoop, that plunge grind, is ending right there at the top of this sharpening choil. And so you have the entire distance of the sharpening choil you need to sharpen before you're going to get any kind of resistance and create a smile. I love to see that. Continuing talking about kind of grips that you'd hold this in for cutting, the shape of this feels so good in the hand. The curves here nestle into the way that your hand naturally curves. Like it's one of those things that feels like it fits like a glove. It is so well done in that regard. And like I said, I don't love pushing my finger right there on that little spot, but this fits in my hand so nicely. This swell right here is important because it gives you a place to anchor your finger back here, while this follows the curve of your hand perfectly, like I said before. And since the overall length here, I measured this at 3.17, so it's a little bit under 3¼ inches, and since the handle here is like 4.113, this overall thing is a knife that fits perfectly into my size territory, but also means that you just have a lot of control over this. It's a really good size to be able to feel like you understand where the tip of the knife is. Now, sometimes when we talk about feeling where the tip of the knife is, we bring up the balance and weight and distribution and everything like that. And that's something I don't want to spend too much time on because it's going to be changing for the production version. On this, there are no skeletonization pockets inside, and so the balance is right around here, which is a little bit further back, and this weighs 3.534 ounces. So 3.5 ounces on a 3.1 inch knife. And so that puts it above the ounce and inch mark. But if you look at the changes that are coming for the prototype, from the prototype to the production version, there's going to be these lightning pockets on the inside. The important part is they're all at the rear of the knife. And so what that's going to do is significantly reduce the weight, but also push that center of gravity towards the center. And this knife, I think, is going to move the balance point from right about there, probably up to right about there, which is exactly where you want it. Continuing ergonomics and general things about carrying it, this clip is really, really nicely done. So this isn't the deepest carry clip or clip positioning. So you'll have basically that much sticking out of your pocket. And this is something that, I always prefer less sticking out of my pocket if possible. But the way that this curves like this means that there's not like a big bulky thing sticking out of your pocket. It's a relatively small amount of the knife. But the bigger thing is that the curves here and the positioning of these means that this just flows really, really nicely at the back. There's no kind of step down, there's no pointy corners. This, I don't feel it at all. And that's really rare to find. I love the way that this flows to the back right there. The clip itself has really nice spring tension and it has a good ramp on it. You can see that it has a curl to the shape right there, that this is going to make this slide in and out of your pocket really quite nicely. Now that's a good segue into one of the more prominent differences between this and the production version. This lock bar relief is going to be moved internally. Now when you're taking a knife in and out of your pocket like this, it's common on a frame lock for your pocket to snag on this corner right here, but moving this internally completely eliminates that. More importantly to me, I think, is that it's just going to give this a much cleaner visual aesthetic where you won't have this big notch right here interrupting this flow. It's going to look much more like the front. But moving a lock bar relief like this internally is complicated on a knife that has a significant chamfer. The reason is because they have to thin this out pretty thin in order to make the lock bar flexible. But if you just try to invert this shape, because there is this chamfer here, the further and further you move this direction to make it thin, the further and further you're going to be unintentionally moving down this slope. To show you what I mean, here is another knife that does that exact same thing. There is the inverted shape right here, but to try to make this thin, they're having to come out this direction. But because this is a slope, coming out this direction means they're also coming back this direction, and you end up with this little cut in. And the thinner that you make it, the deeper and deeper this notch is going to be. So to get around that, Nick is being clever, and what he's doing is making it so the depth of the lock bar relief is actually thicker up here where the chamfer is, and then thins out as it goes in. You can kind of see that in this picture here. I think I have an even better picture where I can pop in to show you, but what you basically see is there's a line here where the lock bar relief is initial depth where the chamfer is, and make it so we don't have to cut down into there, and then drops out below that to thin back out. That's a really important thing that a lot of people just completely miss. And so the side effect when people miss that is they end up not being able to make the lock bar relief as thin. And so they end up with an unintentionally much stiffer lock bar. So I love seeing Nick handle those kinds of small details. Now, one change I would have liked to have seen in the production version is slightly better lock bar access. We have no recession here. And I can understand him not wanting to break up this visual flow for the exact same reasons we're talking about back there. But the end result is that all we have are these little chamfers right here. I find with my particular hands and the size of my fingers, I don't have any difficulty getting in here. I find this actually works quite well, but I know a lot of people don't have the same size thumbs as me and everything like that, and I think that this access is going to be slightly tight for some people. I think what he could have done is increase the size or made the slope of these chamfers just slightly more aggressive, but you do run the risk then of coming to too thin of a spot at the very top, because if you do knock this back too much, you will have a very sharp edge right here, and I can understand him wanting to avoid that. Overall though, I think this works fine, but I do think it would be a problem for some people. So if you do have large thumbs or often find you have difficulty getting your thumbs into lock bar access like that, it might be an issue for you. Rounding out things about the handle, pun slightly intended, one of the nice things is that all of these screws are round head screws back here. That's important because they fall on the chamfer itself. It is the pet peeve of mine when a screw sticks into the chamfer space and thus you can feel it, but the fact that these are rounded out means that all of these, so this slope right here rounds down, and these ones right here round off. It means that while you do feel them, they aren't sharp and there's nothing to snag on. It's not going to be any kind of hard corners or anything like that, even back here on the clip. Okay, now let's talk about one of the most interesting, to me at least, parts of this whole knife, and that's the front flipper design. Now this is something that is changing, and I think it needed to change, but also this is something that I think a lot of people do wrong. To talk about what's going on here, I wanted to bring out these two other knives that I think you're going to recognize. These are both Pena knives in the X series. This is the Apache and the large one in ebony wood, and this is the Raptor. These are definitely different flipper tabs, but they are similar, and these two at first glance probably look the same to you. But there are subtle differences across these that make them all work differently from each other. And in some cases, this works the best. In some cases, this works the best. And in some cases, well, actually all of the cases, this works the best. But the changes that are happening to this flipper tab with the production version make it much more similar to this. So let's talk about what's actually going on here. These are these really short, low-profile flipper tabs that some people call mohawk flipper tabs because of the fact that they have like this aggressive kind of spiky thing that's running along the top. These are kind of like a reaction to the tall, pointy flipper tabs you'll find on some front flipper knives. And a lot of people don't like having that jabby thing there, so people have been trying to make these as sleek and minimal as possible, and so they have it flow along the front here. Now these do stick up slightly above the front, and so you can press on them like this, pressing backward, and use them as a front flipper. Works perfectly fine. But a lot of people are going to open this by pressing their thumb down on the top of this and pulling back like that. It's what people call like a Bic lighter action, where it's like similar to kind of sparking a lighter. Now, on knives like this, where it's hugging down along this curve, you don't have the ability to push on this. There isn't anywhere that you can push on this surface that'll open that blade up. Instead, you have to pull backward on this using traction. So one of the main differences between these two flipper tabs is just what that jimping is like and how much traction it gives you. This is just further spaced out, which gives your finger the ability to kind of sink down in it more, and it's just crisper and sharper. And so this just hugs your finger more and gives you more traction. This, by contrast, is a lot smaller and a lot shallower. And so I find that while if my thumb is not slippery at all, I can open it this way, it's a lot harder and I have to push a lot harder on it in order to compensate for the fact that this just isn't as grippy. But there's another thing going on here. And then part of it is our lever arm distance. If you look, these look very similar at first glance, but the distance from here to where you're pushing versus here, this is about 30% smaller. And so when you talk about opening a knife, you have to overcome the detent strength, sure. You have to apply a certain amount of force to do that, sure. But all of this is actually in terms of torque, because you're putting a certain amount of force on this flipper tab here, and you have a certain amount of lever arm distance on which you're applying that force. And so the further that you pull this out, the less force you have to put on this flipper tab in order to be able to have the same torque to overcome that detent ball. So even though it looks so similar, I do have to put less force on this than I do over here. So the fact that you're putting less force on something that is even more grippy just makes this a much more effective and more comfortable. But there's something even more important. Look at the shape of this in terms of how far this comes out and the shape of this handle. The handle here is thicker, and on this one, the flipper tab ends right here in the center of this pivot. And what that means is that as you open this, that flipper tab disappears into the handle. So if you're pulling right here, like you're trying to do this kind of reach your finger around approach, the place that you are putting traction on disappears and you're no longer making contact with it. And so like back here, I can't continue opening. I can then I could reposition my hand and pull up here, but if I'm pulling from this spot right here, I'm no longer making contact and accelerating the blade. Over here, by contrast, because this is narrow in and because they've extended it further back outward here past the pivot center, I'm actually making contact with this the entire way. Now it's subtle contact, but I am touching right there. It's not sinking below. So I can continue moving this. And because I'm maintaining contact there, I'm able to continue accelerating the blade all the way through the opening position. So this kind of pull downward swooping action doesn't work here and does work over here. Over here, you're required to just do this kind of outward. So what I end up finding is on this one, what works the best if you're trying to do a reach over is this kind of pull out from the front, where I'm instead hooking my finger on this front part right here and pulling back. That actually works really, really well. That kind of pull from the very front. And the reason why it works even better on this one than over here is because if you look, this sticks up slightly more. And this is that same kind of lever arm distance thing we're talking about. The distance from here to here is higher if you're pulling from this corner than it is from here to here. And because this sticks up further past the handle, you have more access to this. You have a better purchase on this. Another part of why that works better than this over here, that works fine, is that you actually have a really good space to put your fingers in the back and stabilize here. This lock bar is very shallow in this dimension, and what that means is that if you're trying to grip it like this to reach around, you actually have a lot of space to put your finger on this back that doesn't involve pressing on that lock bar. The other part of it is that space, even though the overall knife feels very contoured thanks to these chamfers, the actual thing you're pressing on here is flat. That means that as you're kind of pulling back like this kind of motion that wants to twist the knife out of your hand, you're on a flat surface that you're not going to be rolling off of. Over here, there is less space. This is not a bad example. This is actually a really great example of how to do this kind of stuff. This knife is fantastic, but there's less space, and this chamfer here means that it's more likely that your finger is going to slide off this as you're pinching as this is trying to pull out. Whereas over here, it being flat means that you not have that same problem. But for all of these, this one works the best. So why does this work better? From this front flipper reaction, it's working better for the same reason this is, that this just sticks up more prominently and sticks out a little bit further. And so you have just better access to that front part right there if you're trying to do that pushback motion. But for the top, man, this works so much better. And the reason is because this is no longer curving down. This is now following up and actually sticking up more prominently. What that means is that you can push on this. For the first time, you can push. Rather than having to rely on traction and pull, you're able to actually push force on this corner, and that pushes past. And so it's just so much easier and more effective to hook your finger on this corner and pull back with actual force and push rather than having to do traction. And this is actually where this flipper tab is going. If you look at this picture that Nitch sent showing what the new flipper tab is like, he has curved this back up at the front. This is huge. I know this looks subtle, but this is huge because this means it's going to give you an actual surface that you can pull back against, a surface that you can apply force on rather than like a push force, rather than just a pulling force. And also if you're doing the kind of Bic lighter thing with your thumb, it's going to give you a curve there that's hugging your finger in. Now I will say, I don't think you're going to want to put your finger pressure right on this edge because that's probably going to be a little bit jabby. You're going to want to put your pressure right there and use that to kind of hook it in and pull back. Now this is still running right along that center line. So this is still going to run into that same problem, this disappearing into the handle. But I guarantee this is going to be so much easier to deploy for the exact same reason that this is. The other thing that he's doing, which is really important, is he's extending this jimping further down this bar. And what that means is if you're trying to do this kind of action, right now, the only jimping is right here at the very top. And so if you're coming down below it, you're kind of sliding until you get to that first part. And so with the jimping extending downward, you're going to grip all the way down here. It's not just going to be the top of your thumb, but the bottom of your thumb is going to be gripping as well. And that's just going to make it even easier to pull this out reliably. So overall, I am thrilled to see the changes that he's making to this. I am sure that some people will think it is stylistically maybe not as nice having a little tiny point there, but it's going to make it so much more functional. And like I said at the beginning, it's also a really nice tie into the new shield shape. The shield has this curve up right here, which perfectly echoes that curve right there. And I think it makes the whole thing flow so well. So let's talk about the closing action on this knife, because the opening action is quite easy. It's very snappy. I don't want to I spent all that time talking about how this could be done better and will be better on the production version, but it's actually really easy to actuate this knife. But the closing is, I'm surprised. I've experienced a lot of artisan knives, and not all of them have kind of a bumpy, gritty texture as you close, but they've never been like the most smooth things ever, but this is wildly, beautifully smooth. This is so wonderfully glassy, and there's not a whole lot, even though there is good lock bar strength right here, there's not a whole lot of force as you go down, and so it's doing this under camera is incredibly hard, but oh my God, it is so smooth and effortless. And if I'm actually trying to close this at all, man, this is a delightful knife to close. I love it. It's so good. There is one thing though. Now this knife has, the prototype at least, has pretty significant pivot rattle. So what's happening here is that the hole cut into the knife is larger than the actual pivot hole, enough that it's able to move back and forth. Now, often that will result in a kind of a wobbly, rattly feeling in a knife. But because the lock bar pressure is firm enough here, I actually don't notice that sensation on this whatsoever. If you force it to happen, it will happen. But in practice, I never hear it rattle. And the actual experience of closing this, ooh, it's delightful. But one of the things that does cause is this interesting close sound. What's happening is that there's two distinct clicks happening back to back. Let's see if I can get that to happen. What you're hearing here, this first click, that's the sound of the hole in the blade hitting against the pivot. It's the exact same sound you hear if I do this up here. But what's going on is that as the detent ball starts to engage with the detent hole, it's pulling downward on the blade and tapping that hole against the pivot. I can eliminate that by simply pulling outward, where I'm now pre-doing that tap, and now that sound is gone. If I let go, the second one is, of course, the blade closing. The second, that last click is the stop pin, which is an internal stop pin. You can see a picture of that right there's the smile-shaped arc. That's the second click, of course, is the internal stop pin hitting against the edge of the frame. So I don't know if it's going to be like that in the actual production version or not. This is, again, a prototype. But if it is, I don't mind if it comes like this, because this is the kind of thing where like the closing action is so effortless and easy. It's so smooth and wonderful that you don't get any kind of the negative rattle that comes with pivot lash, but you do get that interesting double click. And I personally find that kind of thing to be kind of cool. I like the resonance that comes with it. Although some people I know they'll bug the heck out of them, and they want like that one singular solid click. As far as the actual detent strength, ooh, yeah, that's really nice. So let's pull this back up for my final thoughts. This is a knife that I think this is just so gorgeous. The lines here are so good. The symmetry and balance from a visual design is just so good. I personally am not going to get this black version because I don't like coated blades, but I will say that this little shield here pops so freaking well against the black. Now that right there is going to surprise people. I will be buying one of these in the silver configuration when it finally does drop. And that will be the very first time that I have Damascus in my collection. But the reason why I'm accepting it here, and the reason why it doesn't bother me here, is because it's such a constrained use of it. A lot of times people put just like a full slab of it, or a big, long, huge stripe, the entire Backspacer kind of thing like that. And to be honest, the reason why I personally don't like Damascus on knives is because my brain literally finds it tiring to look at. It's just a really busy color and texture combination that makes it literally hurts my brain to look at it for an extended period of time. So something like this, where it's a very constrained, purposeful, small accent here. It's not the focal point. It's not something that's going to blind my eyes. It's just this wonderful little pop of bright color. And I think this is the kind of usage that I can start getting behind more and more. And then from an actual user perspective, man, this knife feels so good. It just fits my hand so well. The curves are so ergonomic and like natural feeling. The slopes here at the front in a pinch grip feel so good. And the implementation, this is such a good slicing knife, and the tip is slowed down for utility cuts. This just is a fantastic design. I think, Nick, you absolutely knocked it out of the park. I'm really excited for this to come out. I don't normally buy artisan knives because I've mostly experienced some of the, like, their more budgety things. And when they get in the more budgety perspective, they kind of have, well, they don't always have that really premium feel. Well, of course not. They're a budget knife. But when you get up into this space, they did fantastic on this too. Like this, all of the little chamfering everywhere. The actual fit and finish of this is exceptionally well done. So that's just really exciting to see too. I think this knife is amazing, and I'm really looking forward to it coming out so I can have one in my collection. Okay, thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.